The room fell silent as she walked in. Not because they respected her, not because they feared her, because they barely noticed her at all. It had always been like this. Overlooked, underestimated, dismissed before she even had a chance to speak. She knew what they thought. She wasn't powerful enough, smart enough, bold enough. She wasn't born into the right family, didn't have the right connections, didn't belong in the world they controlled. They had decided her limits before she had the chance to prove them wrong. The meeting had already started, the voices in the room sharp, decisive. Every seat at the long table was filled except for the one meant for her. No one had even thought to pull it out. She paused for only a second before stepping forward, dragging the chair back herself. The scrape of metal against the floor was the only sound in the room for a moment before the conversation resumed, as if she wasn't even there. She listened, not just to what was being said, but to what was being left out. The numbers, the projections, the plans, all designed by those who had been in power for years, who saw no reason to change. Her hands curled into fists under the table. They had no idea how wrong they were. The moment finally came when she spoke up. Her voice was steady, clear. The words she had prepared were sharp, calculated, impossible to ignore. But they ignored them anyway. A brief glance in her direction, a dismissive nod, and then they moved on as if she hadn't said anything at all. The message was clear. It didn't matter how much she knew, how hard she worked. In their eyes, she would never be enough. But what they didn't realize was that she had never needed their approval. She had spent years watching, learning, understanding the cracks in their perfect system. She knew exactly where to push, where to disrupt, where to build something stronger. They thought she would give up. They thought she would stay in the shadows, waiting for permission to belong. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She was done proving herself to people who had already decided not to see her. And soon, they wouldn't just see her. They would have no choice but to follow her lead. She walked out of the meeting, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. The dismissal hadn't stung, not anymore. It was expected. They had built this world in their own image, and she wasn't part of it. But what they didn't realize was that she had been preparing for this moment long before she ever stepped into that room. The city stretched before her, tall buildings casting long shadows as she moved through the streets. Every corner, every conversation, every deal happening behind closed doors, she had studied it all. She knew how the system worked. More importantly, she knew where it was weak. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages. A few familiar names, people who had once been just as overlooked as she was. They had been waiting just like her for the right moment to change the rules. She sent a single message. It's time. There was no turning back now. The first step wasn't about proving herself to them. It was about proving to herself that she didn't need them. The network she had built, the knowledge she had gathered, this was her foundation. They had ignored her voice in that meeting, but soon they wouldn't be able to ignore the impact of what she was about to do. She spent the next few days moving quietly, pulling the right people together. Some hesitated, afraid of what it would mean to stand against those in power. Others were eager, tired of being pushed aside, ready for something different. Every night, she stayed up late, running numbers, finding the cracks in their empire. She wasn't looking to destroy it, not yet. She wanted to build something stronger, something they would never see coming. She attended every meeting they invited her to, listened carefully as they continued making the same mistakes, blind to the change happening right under their noses. They still thought she was nobody. But the world was shifting, a ripple turning into a wave. And by the time they noticed, it would already be too late. She moved through the city with purpose, her footsteps steady, her mind sharper than ever. The people in power still looked past her, still dismissed her ideas, but she no longer cared. She was playing a different game now, one they didn't even realize had begun. The network she had built was growing stronger. Every person she had once watched struggle, every voice that had been ignored, was now part of something bigger. They met in quiet corners, in coffee shops where no one paid attention, in buildings they had repurposed into their own headquarters. There was no grand announcement, no public rebellion, just slow, steady change. One of her closest allies, a strategist who had once been pushed out of the industry for challenging the wrong people, leaned over the table where they studied the latest reports. "They don't see it yet, but we're shifting the market under their feet," he murmured, pointing to the numbers. "Investors are paying attention. Small businesses are starting to move toward us." She nodded, but she wasn't celebrating yet. This was just the beginning. The people who had shut her out for so long weren't going to step aside easily. If anything, they would fight harder once they realized what was happening. And they were starting to notice. The first sign came in the form of whispers. Rumors spread about deals falling through, about unexpected competitors rising in industries they had controlled for years. They didn't know who was behind it yet, but they could feel the shift. Then came the warnings. A senior executive, one of the few who had ever spoken to her with something close to respect, pulled her aside after a meeting. His voice was low, careful. "Whatever you're doing, be careful. They don't like change, and they definitely don't like surprises." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of threat, but there was none. Just quiet concern. "I appreciate the advice," she said simply. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't think you do." He glanced around, lowering his voice even more. They built this system to keep control. And when something threatens that control, they eliminate it. She knew he wasn't exaggerating. She had seen it happen before, people being pushed out, their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined overnight. The people at the top played dirty when they had to, but she wasn't backing down. She had come too far. And if they wanted to stop her, they would have to admit finally that she had been a threat all along. The first real attack came quietly, slipping into her world like a shadow before she even saw it coming. A contract she had spent months securing suddenly fell apart. No explanation, no warning. Just a simple email saying the deal was off. She knew it wasn't a coincidence. The people in power had finally noticed her, and they were making their first move. She didn't panic. Instead, she doubled down. She met with her team late into the night, finding alternative routes, securing new partners. For every door they shut in her face, she found another way in. But the pressure was building. A key investor, someone who had once promised full support, hesitated during their last meeting. He looked uneasy, glancing around as if expecting someone to be listening. "I believe in what you're doing," he said, voice low, "but I can't afford to be on the wrong side of this." She understood. Fear had a way of controlling people before they even realized they were being controlled. Still, she wasn't stopping. The next move against her was louder. A carefully planted story began spreading false accusations, whispers meant to discredit her, to make people doubt her leadership. She read the headlines with a steady gaze, feeling the weight of what they were trying to do. They wanted her to react. They wanted her to crumble. But they had underestimated her again. Instead of defending herself, she pushed forward, speaking directly to the people who mattered. Her supporters didn't waver. If anything, they grew stronger, standing beside her with more determination than before. She could feel it now. The final battle was coming. The tension in the air was thick, the stakes higher than ever. They had spent years ignoring her, but now they were trying to destroy her. She was ready. And this time, they would learn what it truly meant to underestimate someone who refused to be controlled. The city skyline flickered with artificial lights, a stark contrast to the shadows where real power moved unseen. She had spent years learning the rules, not to follow them, but to break them in ways they wouldn't expect. The people who had dismissed her were now watching her every move, no longer indifferent but threatened. And when people like them felt threatened, they struck back. The first blow had been subtle, just a business deal slipping through her fingers. But she knew better. She had worked too hard for too long to believe in coincidences. Someone had whispered in the right ears, pulled the right strings, and suddenly, her once solid contract had vanished. It was a warning, a way to test her reaction. Would she back down? Would she walk away? She didn't. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with her team. They gathered in a quiet, dimly lit office, documents spread across the table, coffee cups abandoned in favor of tense discussions. "We knew this was coming," she said, her voice calm, despite the storm she felt brewing inside. "So now, we adjust." Her strategist, a man with sharp instincts and an even sharper mind, leaned over the table. "They're trying to choke our funding. If they succeed, we won't last 6 months." She looked at him, unwavering. "Then we don't give them the chance." She spent the next few days moving faster than ever. Alternative investors, underground backers, new connections, they all had to be secured before her enemies could tighten the noose. But even as she worked, she could feel the walls closing in. Then came the smear campaign. It started with whispers, rumors drifting through boardrooms and high-end social circles. People she had once called allies started to hesitate when they spoke to her, as if they were afraid her reputation would stain them. Then, the headlines appeared, twisted versions of the truth, designed to make her look reckless, unstable, dangerous. The accusations weren't just personal, they were strategic, targeting everything she had built. She read the articles with a quiet fury, her hands tightening into fists before she forced them to relax. This was how they operated. They couldn't beat her outright, so they would try to destroy her credibility instead. But they had underestimated her again. Instead of defending herself, she went straight to the people who mattered. The ones who knew the truth, the ones who had been watching her, long before the headlines started spinning lies. And one by one, they chose to stand with her. Her supporters didn't waver. If anything, they grew stronger. But she wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end. The people in power weren't finished yet. The final battle was coming, and this time, they weren't just trying to stop her. They were trying to erase her. And she refused to let them win. The silence before the next attack was almost worse than the attack itself. She knew it was coming. She could feel it in the way people spoke to her, in the sudden pauses before conversations shifted, in the way even her most loyal allies started watching their words more carefully. The ones trying to stop her weren't done. They had failed to push her out with backdoor deals and smear campaigns, so now they were changing their approach. It started with a betrayal. Someone from her own inner circle, someone she had trusted, turned against her. She found out when a critical document was leaked to the press, something that had never been meant to see the light of day. Not because it was illegal, but because it was unfinished, unpolished, easily twisted into something far worse than reality. It was the perfect weapon, designed to make her look reckless, to turn her supporters into doubters. The fallout was immediate. Calls that used to be answered instantly were now going to voicemail. Business partners who had stood by her side hesitated. The news outlets ran with the story, framing it as a scandal. The headlines screamed betrayal, incompetence, recklessness, everything her enemies had been hoping to convince people of from the beginning. She could have panicked. She could have fought back with anger, called out the traitor, tried to defend herself against every accusation. But she didn't. She knew that was exactly what they wanted. Instead, she disappeared just long enough to make them wonder. She stayed quiet as the world speculated, as her enemies celebrated what they thought was the beginning of her downfall. And while they were distracted, she worked. She found out who had betrayed her. She followed the money, the secret meetings, the messages that had been sent behind her back. And that's when she discovered the real truth. It wasn't just about destroying her reputation. It wasn't just about taking her down. It was about replacing her. Her enemies weren't just trying to stop her, they were trying to take what she had built. They were positioning someone else to step in, to claim her work, her ideas, her vision, and pass it off as their own. She had been fighting to survive. But now, she knew survival wasn't enough. Now, she had to win. She had played their game long enough. Every move they made, every piece they sacrificed, she had studied and learned. But now, she wasn't just reacting, she was leading the game herself. The night before the biggest meeting of her career, she sat alone in her office, staring at the city beyond the glass. They thought they had her cornered, thought she would come in defensive, desperate to explain herself, to fight for what was already hers. They had no idea what was coming. By morning, the room was filled with the very people who had tried to destroy her. Some masked their hostility behind polite smiles. Others didn't bother hiding it. They had come expecting a broken woman, a desperate plea. But she gave them none of that. She placed the final piece of evidence on the table: documents, recordings, undeniable proof of their schemes. The betrayal, the financial manipulations, the lies fed to the media, it was all there, exposed under the unforgiving light of truth. For a moment, there was silence, a stunned, breathless pause as the weight of what they had done became undeniable. Then the panic set in. The room erupted. Some tried to deny, others turned on each other, scrambling to shift blame, to salvage whatever power they could. But it was over. She didn't need to fight anymore. She had already won. And then, just as she thought it was over, the final twist revealed itself. One last betrayal, someone she had counted on, someone who had stood by her side the entire time. They had played both sides, waiting to see who would come out on top. And now, with everything crumbling, they made their move. A sudden shift in the conversation, a carefully worded statement, an attempt to pin everything on her in a last-ditch effort to walk away clean. But they had underestimated her one last time. She smiled, calm, unshaken, because she had known. She had seen it coming before they even realized they were playing into her hands. And with a final decisive move, she dismantled their last hope of escape. By the end of the day, they were gone. Stripped of power, exposed for what they were. And she? She wasn't just standing, she was stronger than ever. But she didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because she knew the truth about power. It was never truly secure. There would always be another battle, another enemy waiting in the shadows. But this time, she was ready. As the dust settled, she found herself standing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened. The people who had tried to take her down were gone. Some had resigned in disgrace, others had been forced out, and a few had simply disappeared from the public eye, their reputations beyond repair. But even in victory, she felt no sense of relief. The weight of everything she had fought for still pressed down on her. Winning wasn't the end of the battle, it was just the beginning of something new. She walked through the halls of the empire she had built, the one they had tried to steal from her. Everything looked the same, yet it felt different. The people she passed still greeted her with respect, but there was something else in their eyes now, something she wasn't sure she had seen before. It wasn't just admiration. It was belief. For so long she had been proving herself, fighting to be taken seriously, to be recognized as someone who belonged here. Now, there was no question. She had set the standard, and there was no going back. She spent the next few days meeting with those who had remained loyal, ensuring that the damage caused by the betrayal was fully repaired. She had learned her lesson about trust, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed people she could rely on, not just to follow her lead, but to challenge her, to keep her grounded. The news cycle had moved on, but the world hadn't forgotten. Every major outlet covered her rise, her resilience, and the downfall of those who had tried to destroy her. Some called her ruthless. Others called her an inspiration. She didn't care what they called her, as long as they remembered that she wasn't going anywhere. One evening, She sat in her office, looking out at the city, the same way she had the night before everything had come crashing down. But this time, she didn't feel the weight of uncertainty. She felt clarity. She had risked everything for this. And now, standing at the top, she realized that power wasn't what defined her. It wasn't the victories or the battles. It was the choices she made in the moments when no one was watching. There would always be more challenges, more obstacles, more people waiting for her to fail. But she had already proven that no matter what came next, she would face it head on. And as she took a deep breath, she allowed herself to smile. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was leading.